Chapter 5, Section 2, The Powers of Congress, Part 2. Hello again, everybody, and welcome. So, today we're going to do Part 2 of Section 2 since it's a little bit lengthier and has a little more information in it. Now, I apologize if I say anything twice from yesterday's video, but let's just get into this so that you can take your notes. So here we have Congress is most often thought of as the branch with all the money, and we spoke before about the power of the purse. Congress can raise money through taxes. Now, there are two ways that we see taxes. They're indirectly and directly. An indirect tax is one that is incorporated into the final cost. Gasoline is the easiest example, but if we look closer at others, it will give you a broader idea. So let's take clothing, for example. Clothing is considered a necessity, and unless, of course, it's lavish and unnecessary, but normal clothing off the rack at a retail store, when you see the price, that is the price. What you don't see are the taxes that garment went through to get on the rack. Yeah. It could be a tax on the sheep that made the wool. It could be from a foreign country, so a tariff had to be paid. The tax on shipping would have been factored into the price of whatever the garment was. So you see, a lot happens to one little item like a shirt. A direct tax is one you know you are paying. I cringe every time I get a paycheck and the government takes 37% of my check. I know that I pay a right to work tax for Mount Pleasant too, and when I started it was around $10, and now it's probably a little over $100. I believe it could be more. In Westmoreland, I know sales tax is 6%, but where I live in Allegheny County, it's 7%. So even if I buy a car in Westmoreland County, which is where I buy my cars, I still get taxed Allegheny County taxes because that is where I reside and that's where the vehicle will reside. Congress can also borrow money from the Treasury to the tune of over almost $30 trillion dollars today. I think last I looked, it was a little over 28 trillion, but creeping closer to that 30 trillion every time you give a stimulus check of 1.3 trillion, you just add that right into this factor. So this debt or deficit will likely never be paid back, at least in my lifetime it won't. And we keep borrowing from future generations at an alarming rate. Now, speaking of taxes, the most well-known tax is the income tax. And that's a tax on earning money. And if you think for a minute that you can hide overseas, well, if you remain an American, you must pay taxes on all monies that you make, which includes interest on your bank money. April 15th is usually tax day, but the past few years, the IRS or president has changed the date to allow more people to file their taxes late because of obviously the COVID reasons. We can thank the 16th Amendment, which forced everyone to pay tax on what they made and no longer relied on apportionment by state to decide how much money the federal government got. Now, this isn't the class for this discussion, but if you don't pay enough taxes, you get hit with absurd penalties. If you keep paying a consistent 37%, you'll likely owe nothing, but you got to factor in things such as like kids, divorces, your lifestyle. That all affects what you owe or what you get back. The Commerce Clause has been mentioned several times in class, and from its inception until about 1950, this was the most contested case in the courts here in the United States. If it crosses state lines, if it deals with civil rights, if it deals with our economy, Congress will and can touch it. This one clause has affected and altered our lives more than any other clause in the Constitution. The President of the United States is considered our leader of all armed forces. For that, we call him the Commander in Chief. But the President does not control the military per se. Congress is the only branch that can declare wars, even though the President can send troops for 60 to 90 days to fight a global conflict. In fact, if you paid attention to the news, President Biden warned Russian President Vladimir Putin that if the U.S. confirmed his actions of tampering with elections, he will pay a price. That's quite the threat by a president. The Vietnam War was really a conflict, much like Korea, because Congress never declared war, which is why the War Powers Resolution of 1973 limited how long soldiers could be deployed by a president. Here's something I bet you didn't know. Congress and the states share the power of the National Guard, or our militia, and Congress has authorized the president to call out that guard when needed. And of course, we saw that happen here on January 6th when the riots broke out in Washington, D.C. So, yes, the state or national guards, they are governed by Congress and can only be sent out by the president, which again would be something you would call a check and a balance. Let's look at a few more expressed powers. We have coinage, and that's the ability to put money in or take it out of circulation. Second is postal service. After creating the postal service, we are still one of the cheapest countries to mail items. By law, the postal service cannot have competition. So, how does UPS or FedEx stay in business if they have to be more expensive? My guess is they're more reliable and they're on time. Three is copyrights and patents, and this is why plagiarism is such a big deal. Do you know that the only president to hold a patent is? It's Abe Lincoln. It was for something on a ship. Then we have weights and measures. We went with customary units over metric, and in fact, in 1959, we did get together with Europe and decide on how much each item was worth in those areas. And how many of you know your metric measurements where you could actually see things in the United States today? I personally don't. You know, you see these things in rulers, on cars, on signs, but if you put me into Europe, I don't know if I could use the metric system that they have there, to be honest with you. Then you have bankruptcy, and this is a concept was more important to keep the economy rolling smoothly. Bankruptcy laws penalize people for around 7 years, but once out, it's a clean slate for that person. So that's the bonus of it. Naturalization. So today, to become naturalized, one must answer 20 questions to become a U.S. citizen. And there is a list of 200 or so that immigrants can study, but only 20 are asked. The test I administered last Wednesday is part of the naturalization test. So if you scored higher than an 85%, you can become a citizen. And one of the things that, if you're paying attention to the news right now, you have a lot of Central American immigrants from Honduras coming into the United States and being allowed into the United States where other groups from Central Latin America are not. So everything that Donald Trump built is being slowly taken apart by President Biden. So we'll see how this ends up. Then you have federal courts, and all courts, not the Supreme Court, were created by Congress, and the president picks the judges, and the Senate confirms those judges, and those judges are put in for life or until they die. Are you starting to see the cycle of how each affects each other? And number eight, elections. Elections are dictated by Congress, but the states have the power to decide how that election will take place. An example of this would be how we used to use the computer ballots, and this past year we went back to paper ballots, and the state decided that. But other things could be registering for voting, criminals, and whether they can vote, and so on. A concept that you've heard before that we will reinforce and master today comes from how we read the Constitution. If you read it word for word as it stands with no interpretation, then you would be known as a strict constructionist. But if you read the Constitution and are open to interpretation because you read between the lines, then you support loose constructionism. Consider the Second Amendment. It states a well regulated militia. Well, how many of you have guns at home? Are you in a militia? But yet you have guns. In the case of McCulloch versus Maryland, when Congress created a national court and Maryland attempted to disrupt that fact, the Supreme Court made known that Congress has the ability to create things based out of need that isn't listed in the Constitution, which became known as the Elastic Clause, or an ability to stretch things. If we look at the insert here, let's run down all the express powers that turn into implied powers. The express power to collect taxes to support the general welfare turns into an implied power, which we then use that money to build roads and highways, educational needs, and housing. And this all falls right into Johnson's Great Society plan back in the 1960s, where he thought it would be great to demolish all the slums and then, of course, build high rises and put everybody in those. And well, that just turned into a whole different criminal society. Number two is to raise armies, and the is the next express power, and the implied section would be age limits, the draft, and the creation of highways and interstate highways to move troops. And This is where Eisenhower comes in. He was our five-star general who became president, and if you go on the interstates around our area or highways around our area, you might see a sign with just 5 stars. That's an Eisenhower five-star sign or a sign that created that highway for this mere fact to move the troops. Next, we see to make all laws necessary and proper as the express power, and this could be Medicare, Medicaid, or even the example that I said yesterday with the school lunches. And lastly, to regulate commerce as an express power that turns into laws that affect our minimum wage, our working hours, our working conditions, our health standards for food, and for what I was talking about earlier when we talk about health standards for food, and we talked about the FDA yesterday. One of the things that I didn't mention is that the FDA allows 8 bug parts per candy bar. So it's just considered protein, but think about that for a second. And of course, the other things that discrimination, child labor laws, and the list is endless when we talk about this. Congress also has the ability to propose amendments, considering we've been around since 1789 and we have only 27 changes to the Constitution. This wouldn't be something that we use often or at all. But if 2/3 of Congress can pass an amendment, it would take 3/4 of the states to pass that law. And that would be a check on the balance of power. And of course, that's making sure that the people, when you're talking 3/4 of the states, you're talking about the people wanting that law. Small states and large states. Another non legislative power by Congress is to conduct investigations and hearings. We may explore these later, but the most well known example would be Senator Joseph McCarthy, who back in the 1950s went after socialists and communists in our country, and this became known as the Second Red Scare. Subpoenas were issued to Hollywood stars and high profile Jews, and in fact, it was a modern day witch hunt, which the only two people to ever be executed for this were Julius and Rosal Ethenberg. Well, the other thing that can happen here is Congress also has the power to impeach. And I mentioned the other day that all impeachment proceedings begin in the House of Representatives, whereas the Senate is tasked with investigating and confirming things, and from election tampering to the use of Facebook. The Senate also approves all presidential nominations from judges to cabinet members and also the treaties that he makes. We now have a firm idea of the two sides of Congress. Another power that the House has is that it can choose the president if there's no majority, and this was done in 1800 and again in 1824. Jefferson won over Burr, who ironically was running for president too, and again in 1824, which became known as the corrupt bargain, cost Andrew Jackson this election. Um, of course, Aaron Burr, if you don't remember him, he's the one who, as the vice president, shot and killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel. Um, so anyhow, going back to 1824, when Jackson clearly won by the popular vote, and they stripped him of this presidency, um, this could be a reason that Andrew Jackson became, the way he did. On the flip side, the Senate can choose the vice president when the House chooses a president, and confirm appointments and approve or deny all treaties. When we talk about checks and balances, and how one branch is watching another branch, and they're making sure that nobody gets too much power, which I always say the Supreme Court has more power than anybody. But anyhow, when we talk about checks and balances, one thing we cannot overlook is how much power that Supreme Court does have, and they decide on whether or not laws are constitutional. Whereas the president can veto a law, which is a check too, but Congress can override a veto. The Constitution also mentioned that Congress couldn't touch slave trading until 1808, but prior to that, it was fair game and left unchecked. And if you find that reprehensible, it was a trade off for the people who also found it reprehensible. They figured in 1808 it would go away, and little did they know that it would lead to one of the greatest wars in the nation. Um, Congress is also checked from favoring states, whether it be due to better ports or crops. All have to be treated equally in this country. And also, we mentioned habeas corpus, the bill of attainder, and ex post facto laws yesterday, so there are no questions. Let's just finish up then. And this takes us to the Great Depression, and this event was new. It's never was before seen on this kind of scale, but it was worldwide. And Congress had to pass new programs, specifically things like Social Security, and they also put in mandatory retirement so that people could quit and younger people would have jobs, and they also had to deal with all that unemployment. So Congress has things to get done when things are unforeseen. Um, when World War II came after the Great Depression, Congress had to create new spy organizations. They created an Air Force. The 1950s, they created the Space Agency. After the 9/11 attacks, they created the Patriot Act. So you see, Congress does indeed do a lot more than you would know. So that's it, folks. You have a quiz tomorrow. And of course, if you made it this far in the video and you put a 16 after your bell ringer, the number 16, 1 and 6, well, you'll get 10 bonus points. Have a great day, Mount Pleasant.